Female genital mutilation, Wikipedia audio. Female genital mutilation, also known as female genital cutting and female circumcision, is the ritual cutting or removal of some or all of the external female genitalia. The practice is found in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and within communities from countries in which FGM is common. UNICEF estimated in 2016 that 200 million women living today in 30 countries, 27 African countries, Indonesia, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Yemen have undergone the procedures. Typically carried out by a traditional circumciser using a blade, FGM is conducted from days after birth to puberty and beyond. In half the countries for which national figures are available, most girls are cut before the age of 5. Procedures differ according to the country or ethnic group. They include removal of the clitoral hood and clitoral glands, removal of the inner labia, and removal of the inner and outer labia and closure of the vulva. In this last procedure, known as infibulation, a small hole is left for the passage of urine and menstrual fluid. The vagina is opened for intercourse and opened further for childbirth. The practice is rooted in gender inequality, attempts to control women's sexuality, and ideas about purity, modesty, and beauty. It is usually initiated and carried out by women, who see it as a source of honor, and who fear that failing to have their daughters and granddaughters cut will expose the girls to social exclusion. Health effects depend on the procedure. They can include recurrent infections, difficulty urinating and passing menstrual flow, chronic pain, the development of cysts, an inability to get pregnant, complications during childbirth, and fatal bleeding. There are no known health benefits. Terminology. There have been international efforts since the 1970s to persuade practitioners to abandon FGM, and it has been outlawed or restricted in most of the countries in which it occurs, although the laws are poorly enforced. Since 2010, the United Nations has called upon healthcare providers to stop performing all forms of the procedure, including re-infibulation after childbirth and symbolic nicking of the clitoral hood. The opposition to the practice is not without its critics, particularly among anthropologists, who have raised difficult questions about cultural relativism and the universality of human rights. Until the 1980s, FGM was widely known in English as female circumcision, implying an equivalence in severity with male circumcision. From 1929, the Kenya Missionary Council referred to it as the sexual mutilation of women, following the lead of Marion Scott Stevenson, a Church of Scotland missionary. The practice as mutilation increased throughout the 1970s. In 1975, Rose Oldfield Hayes, an American anthropologist, used the term female genital mutilation in the title of a paper in American Ethnologist, and 4 years later Fran Hosken, an Austrian-American feminist writer, called it mutilation in her influential The Hosken Report, Genital and Sexual Mutilation of Females. The Inter-African Committee on Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children began referring to it as female genital mutilation in 1990, and the World Health Organization followed suit in 1991. Other English terms include female genital cutting and female genital mutilation/cutting, preferred by those who work with practitioners. Nawal El Saadai, Woman at Point Zero, London, Zed Books, 1975, Waris Deary and Kathleen Miller, Desert Flower, New York, William Morrow, 1998, Fauzi Yakasanja and Layli Miller Morrow, Do They Hear You When You Cry, New York, Delacorte Press, 1998, Ayan Hersai Ali, Infidel, My Life, New York, Simon & Schuster, 2007. In countries where FGM is common, the practice's many variants are reflected in dozens of terms, often alluding to purification. In the Bambara language, spoken mostly in Mali, it is known as Bolo Koli, and in the Igbo language in eastern Nigeria as Isa Aru or Iwu Aru. A common Arabic term for purification has the root thr, used for male and female circumcision. It is also known in Arabic as kaf or kafa. Communities may refer to FGM as pharaonic for infibulation and Sunna circumcision for everything else. Sunna means path or way in Arabic and refers to the tradition of Muhammad, although none of the procedures are required within Islam. The term infibulation derives from fibula, Latin for clasp. The ancient Romans reportedly fastened clasps through the foreskins or labia of slaves to prevent sexual intercourse. The surgical infibulation of women came to be known as pharaonic circumcision in Sudan, but as Sudanese circumcision in Egypt. In Somalia it is known simply as qadab. The procedures are generally performed by a traditional circumciser in the girls' homes, with or without anesthesia. The cutter is usually an older woman, but in communities where the male barber has assumed the role of health worker, he will perform FGM too. When traditional cutters are involved, non-sterile devices are likely to be used, including knives, razors, scissors, glass, sharpened rocks and fingernails. 491 According to a nurse in Uganda, quoted in 2007 in The Lancet, a cutter would use one knife on up to 30 girls at a time. Health professionals are often involved in Egypt, Kenya, Indonesia, and Sudan. In Egypt 77% of FGM procedures, and in Indonesia over 50%, were performed by medical professionals as of 2008 and 2016. Women in Egypt reported in 1995 that a local anesthetic had been used on their daughters in 60% of cases, a general anesthetic in 13%, and neither in 25%. The WHO, UNICEF and UNFPA issued a joint statement in 1997 defining FGM as all procedures involving partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs, whether for cultural or other non-therapeutic reasons. The procedures vary considerably according to ethnicity and individual practitioners. During a 1998 survey in Niger, women responded with over 50 different terms when asked what was done to them. Translation problems are compounded by the women's confusion over which type of FGM they experienced, or even whether they experienced it. Several studies have suggested that survey responses are unreliable. A 2003 study in Ghana found that in 1995 4% said they had not undergone FGM, but in 2000 said they had, while 11% switched in the other direction. In Tanzania in 2005, 66% reported FGM, but a medical exam found that 73% had undergone it. In Sudan in 2006, a significant percentage of infibulated women and girls reported a less severe type. Standard questionnaires from United Nations bodies ask women whether they or their daughters have undergone the following: cut, no flesh removed, cut, some flesh removed, sewn closed, or type not determined / unsure / doesn't know. The most common procedures fall within the cut, some flesh removed category and involve complete or partial removal of the clitoral glands. The World Health Organization created a more detailed typology. Types I3 vary in how much tissue is removed. Type 3 is the UNICEF category sewn closed. Type 4 describes miscellaneous procedures, including symbolic nicking. Type I is partial or total removal of the clitoris and/or the prepuce. Type IA involves removal of the clitoral hood only. This is rarely performed alone. The more common procedure is type IB, the complete or partial removal of the clitoral glands and clitoral hood. The circumciser pulls the clitoral glands with her thumb and index finger and cuts it off. Type 2 is the complete or partial removal of the inner labia, with or without removal of the clitoral glands and outer labia. Type IIA is removal of the inner labia. Type IIB, removal of the clitoral glands and inner labia, and type IIC, removal of the clitoral glands, inner and outer labia. Excision in French can refer to any form of FGM. Type 3, the sewn closed category, involves the removal of the external genitalia and fusion of the wound. The inner and/or outer labia are cut away, with or without removal of the clitoral glands. Type 3 is found largely in Northeast Africa, particularly Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan. According to one 2008 estimate, over 8 million women in Africa are living with type 3 FGM. According to UNFPA in 2010, 20% of women with FGM have been infibulated. In Somalia, a child is made to squat on a stool or mat facing the circumciser at a height that offers her a good view of the parts to be handled. Adult helpers grab and pull apart the legs of the girl. If available, this is the stage at which a local anesthetic would be used. Methods. The element of speed and surprise is vital, and the circumciser immediately grabs the clitoris by pinching it between her nails, aiming to amputate it with a slash. The organ is then shown to the senior female relatives of the child, who will decide whether the amount that has been removed is satisfactory or whether more is to be cut off. After the clitoris has been satisfactorily amputated, the circumciser can proceed with the total removal of the labia minora and the paring of the inner walls of the labia majora. Since the entire skin on the inner walls of the labia majora has to be removed all the way down to the perineum, this becomes a messy business. By now, the child is screaming, struggling, and bleeding profusely, which makes it difficult for the circumciser to hold with bare fingers and nails the slippery skin and parts that are to be cut or sutured together. The amputated parts might be placed in a pouch for the girl to wear. A single hole of 2-3 mm is left for the passage of urine and menstrual fluid. The vulva is closed with surgical thread, or agave, or acacia thorns, and might be covered with a poultice of raw egg, herbs, and sugar. To help the tissue bond, the girl's legs are tied together, often from hip to ankle. The bindings are usually loosened after a week and removed after 2 to 6 weeks. 491 If the remaining hole is too large in the view of the girl's family, the procedure is repeated. The vagina is opened for sexual intercourse, for the first time either by a midwife with a knife or by the woman's husband with his penis. In some areas, including Somaliland, female relatives of the bride and groom might watch the opening of the vagina to check that the girl is a virgin. The woman is opened further for childbirth, and closed again afterwards. Re-infibulation can involve cutting the vagina again to restore the pinhole size of the first infibulation. This might be performed before marriage, and after childbirth, divorce, and widowhood. Hanny Lightfoot Klein interviewed hundreds of women and men in Sudan in the 1980s about sexual intercourse with type 3. The penetration of the bride's infibulation takes anywhere from 3 or 4 days to several months. Some men are unable to penetrate their wives at all, and the task is often accomplished by a midwife under conditions of great secrecy, since this reflects negatively on the man's potency. Some who are unable to penetrate their wives manage to get them pregnant in spite of the infibulation, and the woman's vaginal passage is then cut open to allow birth to take place. Those men who do manage to penetrate their wives do so often, or perhaps always, with the help of the little knife. This creates a tear which they gradually rip more and more until the opening is sufficient to admit the penis. Type 4 is LOL. Other harmful procedures to the female genitalia for non-medical purposes, including pricking, piercing, incising, scraping and cauterization. It includes nicking of the clitoris, burning or scarring the genitals, and introducing substances into the vagina to tighten it. Labia stretching is also categorized as type 4. Common in southern and eastern Africa, the practice is supposed to enhance sexual pleasure for the man and add to the sense of a woman as a closed space. From the age of 8, girls are encouraged to stretch their inner labia using sticks and massage. Girls in Uganda are told they may have difficulty giving birth without stretched labia. A definition of FGM from the WHO in 1995 included gishiri cutting and angarya cutting, found in Nigeria and Niger. These were removed from the WHO's 2008 definition because of insufficient information about prevalence and consequences. Angarya cutting is excision of the hymen, usually performed 7 days after birth. Gishiri cutting involves cutting the vagina's front or back wall with a blade or penknife, performed in response to infertility, obstructed labor, and other conditions. In a study by Nigerian physician Maro Usman Mandara, over 30% of women with gishiri cuts were found to have vesicovaginal fistulae. Classification. Variation. FGM harms women's physical and emotional health throughout their lives. It has no known health benefits. The short-term and late complications depend on the type of FGM, whether the practitioner has had medical training, and whether they used antibiotics and sterilized or single-use surgical instruments. In the case of type 3, other factors include how small a hole was left for the passage of urine and menstrual blood, whether surgical thread was used instead of agave or acacia thorns, and whether the procedure was performed more than once. Types. Complications. Short-term and late. Pregnancy, childbirth. Psychological effects, sexual function. Common short-term complications include swelling, excessive bleeding, pain, urine retention, and healing problems/wound infection. A 2015 systematic review of 56 studies that recorded immediate complications suggested that each of these occurred in more than 1 in 10 girls and women undergoing any form of FGM, including symbolic nicking of the clitoris, although the risks increased with type 3. The review also suggested that there was under-reporting. Other short-term complications include fatal bleeding, anemia, urinary infection, septicemia, tetanus, gangrene, necrotizing fasciitis, and endometritis. It is not known how many girls and women die as a result of the practice, because complications may not be recognized or reported. The practitioner's use of shared instruments is thought to aid the transmission of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV, although no epidemiological studies have shown this. Late complications vary depending on the type of FGM. They include the formation of scars and keloids that lead to strictures and obstruction, epidermoid cysts that may become infected, and neuroma formation involving nerves that supplied the clitoris. 491–492 An infibulated girl may be left with an opening as small as 2–3 mm, which can cause prolonged, drop-by-drop urination, pain while urinating, and a feeling of needing to urinate all the time. Urine may collect underneath the scar, leaving the area under the skin constantly wet, which can lead to infection and the formation of small stones. The opening is larger in women who are sexually active or have given birth by vaginal delivery, but the urethra opening may still be obstructed by scar tissue. Vesicovaginal or rectovaginal fistulae can develop. This and other damage to the urethra and bladder can lead to infections and incontinence, pain during sexual intercourse and infertility. 491–492 Painful periods are common because of the obstruction to the menstrual flow, and blood can stagnate in the vagina and uterus. Complete obstruction of the vagina can result in hematocolpo and hematometra. The swelling of the abdomen that results from the collection of fluid, together with the lack of menstruation, can lead to suspicion of pregnancy. Asma El-Darar, a Sudanese physician, reported in 1979 that a girl in Sudan with this condition was killed by her family. FGM may place women at higher risk of problems during pregnancy and childbirth, which are more common with the more extensive FGM procedures. Infibulated women may try to make childbirth easier by eating less during pregnancy to reduce the baby's size. 99 In women with vesicovaginal or rectovaginal fistulae, it is difficult to obtain clear urine samples as part of prenatal care, making the diagnosis of conditions such as preeclampsia harder. 491–492 Cervical evaluation during labor may be impeded and labor prolonged or obstructed. Third-degree laceration, anal sphincter damage, and emergency caesarean section are more common in infibulated women. 97. Distribution. Neonatal mortality is increased. The WHO estimated in 2006 that an additional 10–20 babies die per 1,000 deliveries as a result of FGM. The estimate was based on a study conducted on 28,393 women attending delivery wards at 28 obstetric centers in Burkina Faso, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and Sudan. In those settings, all types of FGM were found to pose an increased risk of death to the baby, 15% higher for type I, 32% for type II, and 55% for type 3. The reasons for this were unclear, but may be connected to genital and urinary tract infections and the presence of scar tissue. The researchers wrote that FGM was associated with an increased risk to the mother of damage to the perineum and excessive blood loss, as well as a need to resuscitate the baby, and stillbirth, perhaps because of a long second stage of labor. According to a 2015 systematic review, there is little high-quality information available on the psychological effects of FGM. Several small studies have concluded that women with FGM suffer from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Feelings of shame and betrayal can develop when women leave the culture that practices FGM and learn that their condition is not the norm, but within the practicing culture they may view their FGM with pride, because for them it signifies beauty, respect for tradition, chastity, and hygiene. Studies on sexual function have also been small. A 2013 meta-analysis of 15 studies involving 12,671 women from 7 countries concluded that women with FGM were twice as likely to report no sexual desire and 52% more likely to report dyspareunia. 1/3 reported reduced sexual feelings. Aid agencies define the prevalence of FGM as the percentage of the 15-49 age group that has experienced it. These figures are based on nationally representative household surveys known as demographic and health surveys, developed by Macro International and funded mainly by the United States Agency for International Development, and multiple indicator cluster surveys conducted with financial and technical help from UNICEF. These surveys have been carried out in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere roughly every 5 years, since 1984 and 1995 respectively. The first to ask about FGM was the 1989-1990 DHS in northern Sudan. The first publication to estimate FGM prevalence based on DHS data was by Dara Carr of Macro International in 1997. Women are asked during the surveys, was the genital area just nicked/cut without removing any flesh? Was any flesh removed from the genital area? Was your genital area sewn? Most women report cut, some flesh removed. Type I is the most common form in Egypt, and in the southern parts of Nigeria. Type III is concentrated in northeastern Africa, particularly Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia, and Sudan. In surveys in 2002-2006, 30% of cut girls in Djibouti, 38% in Eritrea, and 63% in Somalia had experienced Type III. There is also a high prevalence of infibulation among girls in Niger and Senegal, and in 2013 it was estimated that in Nigeria 3% of the 0-14 age group had been infibulated. The type of procedure is often linked to ethnicity. In Eritrea, for example, a survey in 2002 found that all Hedareb girls had been infibulated, compared with 2% of the Tigrinya, most of whom fell into the cut, no flesh removed category. FGM is found mostly in what Gary Mackey called an intriguingly contiguous zone in Africa east to west from Somalia to Senegal, and north to south from Egypt to Tanzania. Nationally representative figures are available for 27 countries in Africa, as well as Indonesia, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Yemen. Over 200 million women and girls are thought to be living with FGM in those 30 countries. The highest concentrations among the 15-49 age group are in Somalia, Guinea, Djibouti, Egypt, and Sierra Leone. As of 2013, 27.2 million women had undergone FGM in Egypt, 23.8 million in Ethiopia, and 19.9 million in Nigeria. There is also a high concentration in Indonesia, where Type I and Type IV are practiced. The Indonesian Ministry of Health and the Indonesian Ulama Council both say that the clitoris should not be cut. The prevalence rate for the 0-11 group in Indonesia is 49%. Two smaller studies or anecdotal reports suggest that FGM is also practiced in Colombia, the Congo, Malaysia, Oman, Peru, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, and the United Arab Emirates, by the Bedouin in Israel, in Rama, Jordan, and by the Dawoodi Bara in India. It is also found within immigrant communities around the world. Household surveys. Prevalence figures for the 15-19 age group and younger show a downward trend. For example, Burkina Faso fell from 89% to 58%, Egypt from 97% to 70%, and Kenya from 41% to 11%. From 2010 household surveys asked women about the FGM status of all their living daughters. The highest concentrations among girls aged 0-14 were in Gambia, Mauritania, Indonesia, and Guinea. The figures suggest that a girl was one-third less likely in 2014 to undergo FGM than she was 30 years ago. If the rate of decline continues, the number of girls cut will nevertheless rise from 3.6 million a year in 2013 to 4.1 million in 2050 because of population growth. Surveys have found FGM to be more common in rural areas, less common in most countries among girls from the wealthiest homes, and less common in girls whose mothers had access to primary or secondary/higher education. In Somalia and Sudan the situation was reversed. In Somalia the mother's access to secondary/higher education was accompanied by a rise in prevalence of FGM in their daughters, and in Sudan access to any education was accompanied by a rise. Type of FGM. FGM is not invariably a rite of passage between childhood and adulthood, but is often performed on much younger children. Girls are most commonly cut shortly after birth to age 15. In half the countries for which national figures were available in 2000-2010, most girls had been cut by age 5. Over 80% are cut before the age of 5 in Nigeria, Mali, Eritrea, Ghana, and Mauritania. The 1997 Demographic and Health Survey in Yemen found that 76% of girls had been cut within 2 weeks of birth. The percentage is reversed in Somalia, Egypt, Chad, and the Central African Republic, where over 80% are cut between 5 and 14. Just as the type of FGM is often linked to ethnicity, so is the mean age. In Kenya, for example, the Gishi cut around age 10 and the Kamba at 16. A country's national prevalence often reflects a high subnational prevalence among certain ethnicities, rather than a widespread practice. In Iraq, for example, FGM is found mostly among the Kurds in Erbil, Sulaymaniyat, and Kirkuk, giving the country a national prevalence of 8%. The practice is sometimes an ethnic marker, but it may differ along national lines. For example, in the northeastern regions of Ethiopia and Kenya, which share a border with Somalia, the Somali people practice FGM at around the same rate as they do in Somalia. But in Guinea, all Fulani women responding to a survey in 2012 said they had experienced FGM, against 12% of the Fulani in Chad, while in Nigeria the Fulani are the only large ethnic group in the country not to practice it. Prevalence. Rural areas, wealth, education. Age, ethnicity. Dahabo Musa, a Somali woman, described infibulation in a 1988 poem as the 3 feminine sorrows, the procedure itself, the wedding night when the woman is cut open, then childbirth when she is cut again. Despite the evident suffering, it is women who organize all forms of FGM. Anthropologist Rose Oldfield Hayes wrote in 1975 that educated Sudanese men who did not want their daughters to be infibulated would find the girls had been sewn up after the grandmothers arranged a visit to relatives. 624 Gary Mackey has compared the practice to foot binding. Like FGM, foot binding was carried out on young girls, nearly universal where practiced, tied to ideas about honor, chastity, and appropriate marriage, and supported and transmitted by women. FGM practitioners see the procedures as marking not only ethnic boundaries but also gender difference. According to this view, male circumcision dehumanizes men while FGM demasculinizes women. Fwambe Iamadu, an anthropologist and member of the Kono people of Sierra Leone, who in 1992 underwent clitoridectomy as an adult during a Sandhi Society initiation, argued in 2000 that it is a male-centered assumption that the clitoris is important to female sexuality. African female symbolism revolves instead around the concept of the womb. Infibulation draws on that idea of enclosure and fertility. Genital cutting completes the social definition of a child's sex by eliminating external traces of androgyny, Janice Body wrote in 2007. The female body is then covered, closed, and its productive blood bound within. The male body is unveiled, opened, and exposed. In communities where infibulation is common, there is a preference for women's genitals to be smooth, dry, and without odor, and both women and men may find the natural vulva repulsive. 435–436 Men seem to enjoy the effort of penetrating an infibulation. The local preference for dry sex causes women to introduce substances into the vagina to reduce lubrication, including leaves, tree bark, toothpaste, and Vicks menthol rub. The WHO includes this practice within type 4 FGM, because the added friction during intercourse can cause lacerations and increase the risk of infection. Because of the smooth appearance of an infibulated vulva, there is also a belief that infibulation increases hygiene. 437. Common reasons for FGM cited by women in surveys are social acceptance, religion, hygiene, preservation of virginity, marriageability, and enhancement of male sexual pleasure. In a study in northern Sudan, published in 1983, only 17.4% of women opposed FGM, and most preferred excision and infibulation over clitoridectomy. Attitudes are changing slowly. In Sudan in 2010, 42% of women who had heard of FGM said the practice should continue. In several surveys since 2006, over 50% of women in Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Gambia, and Egypt supported FGM's continuance, while elsewhere in Africa, Iraq, and Yemen most said it should end, although in several countries only by a narrow margin. Against the argument that women willingly choose FGM for their daughters, UNICEF calls the practice a self-enforcing social convention to which families feel they must conform to avoid uncut daughters facing social exclusion. Ellen Grunbaum reported that, in Sudan in the 1970s, cut girls from an Arab ethnic group would mock uncut Zabarma girls with "Yay, Gulfa." The Zabarma girls would respond "Yay, Mutmura." But despite throwing the insult back, the Zabarma girls would ask their mothers, "What's the matter? Don't we have razor blades like the Arabs?" 432–433. Because of poor access to information, and because circumcisers downplay the causal connection, women may not associate the health consequences with the procedure. Lala Bald, president of a women's association in Medina Cherif, a village in Senegal, told Mackey in 1998 that when girls fell ill or died, it was attributed to evil spirits. When informed of the causal relationship between FGM and ill health, Mackey wrote, "The women broke down and wept." He argued that surveys taken before and after this sharing of information would show very different levels of support for FGM. The American non-profit group Tostan, founded by Molly Melching in 1991, introduced community empowerment programs in several countries that focus on local democracy, literacy, and education about healthcare, giving women the tools to make their own decisions. In 1997, using the Tostan program, Malakounda Bambara in Senegal became the first village to abandon FGM. By 2018, over 8,000 communities in 8 countries had pledged to abandon FGM and child marriage. Surveys have shown a widespread belief, particularly in Mali, Mauritania, Guinea, and Egypt, that FGM is a religious requirement. Grunbaum has argued that practitioners may not distinguish between religion, tradition, and chastity, making it difficult to interpret the data. FGM's origins in northeastern Africa are pre-Islamic, but the practice became associated with Islam because of that religion's focus on female chastity and seclusion. There is no mention of it in the Quran. It is praised in a few Daf hadith as noble but not required. In 2007, the Al-Azhar Supreme Council of Islamic Research in Cairo ruled that FGM had no basis in core Islamic law or any of its partial provisions. There is no mention of FGM in the Bible. Christian missionaries in Africa were among the first to object to FGM, but Christian communities in Africa do practice it. A 2013 UNICEF report identified 17 African countries in which at least 10% of Christian women and girls aged 15 to 49 had undergone FGM. In Niger, 55% of Christian women and girls had experienced it, compared with 2% of their Muslim counterparts. The only Jewish group known to have practiced it are the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. Judaism requires male circumcision, but does not allow FGM. FGM is also practiced by animist groups, particularly in Guinea and Mali. The practice's origins are unknown, but its east-west, north-south distribution in Africa meets in Sudan. Gary Mackey has suggested that infibulation began there with the Meroite civilization, before the rise of Islam, to increase confidence in paternity. According to historian Mary Knight, spell 1117 of the ancient Egyptian coffin texts may refer in hieroglyphs to an uncircumcised girl. The spell was found on the sarcophagus of Siddhi-Hotep, now in the Egyptian Museum, and dates to Egypt's Middle Kingdom. The proposed circumcision of an Egyptian girl, Tathamis, is also mentioned on a Greek papyrus, from 163 BCE, in the British Museum. Sometime after this, Nephoris defrauded me, being anxious that it was time for Tathamis to be circumcised, as is the custom among the Egyptians. The examination of mummies has shown no evidence of FGM. Citing the Australian pathologist Grafton Elliott Smith, who examined hundreds of mummies in the early 20th century, Knight writes that the genital area may resemble type 3 because during mummification the skin of the outer labia was pulled toward the anus to cover the pudendal cleft, possibly to prevent sexual violation. It was similarly not possible to determine whether types I or II had been performed, because soft tissues had deteriorated or been removed by the embalmers. The Greek geographer Strabo wrote about FGM after visiting Egypt around 25 BCE. This is one of the customs most zealously pursued by them, to raise every child that is born and to circumcise the males and excise the females. Philo of Alexandria also made reference to it. The Egyptians by the custom of their country circumcise the marriageable youth and maid in the 14th of their age, when the male begins to get seed, and the female to have a menstrual flow. It is mentioned briefly in a work attributed to the Greek physician Galen. When sticks out to a great extent in their young women, Egyptians consider it appropriate to cut it out. Another Greek physician, Aetius of Amida, offered more detail in Book 16 of his 16 books on medicine, citing the physician Philomenes. The procedure was performed in case the clitoris, or nymph, grew too large or triggered sexual desire when rubbing against clothing. On this account, it seemed proper to the Egyptians to remove it before it became greatly enlarged, Oedius wrote, especially at that time when the girls were about to be married. The surgery is performed in this way: have the girl sit on a chair while a muscled young man standing behind her places his arms below the girl's thighs. Have him separate and steady her legs and whole body. Standing in front and taking hold of the clitoris with a broad-mouthed forceps in his left hand, the surgeon stretches it outward, while with the right hand, he cuts it off at the point next to the pincers of the forceps. It is proper to let a length remain from that cut off, about the size of the membrane that's between the nostrils, so as to take away the excess material only. As I have said, the part to be removed is at that point just above the pincers of the forceps. Because the clitoris is a skin-like structure and stretches out excessively, do not cut off too much, as a urinary fistula may result from cutting such large growths too deeply. The genital area was then cleaned with a sponge, frankincense powder, and wine or cold water, and wrapped in linen bandages dipped in vinegar, until the seventh day, when calamine, rose petals, date pits or a genital powder made from baked clay might be applied. Whatever the practice's origins, infibulation became linked to slavery. Mackey cites the Portuguese missionary João dos Santos, who in 1609 wrote of a group near Mogadishu who had a custom to sew up their females, especially their slaves being young, to make them unable for conception, which makes these slaves sell dearer, both for their chastity, and for better confidence which their masters put in them. Thus, Mackey argues, a practice associated with shameful female slavery came to stand for honor. Gynecologists in 19th-century Europe and the United States removed the clitoris to treat insanity and masturbation. A British doctor, Robert Thomas, suggested clitoridectomy as a cure for nymphomania in 1813. The first reported clitoridectomy in the West, described in The Lancet in 1825, was performed in 1822 in Berlin by Karl Ferdinand von Graefe on a 15-year-old girl who was masturbating excessively. Isaac Baker Brown, an English gynecologist, President of the Medical Society of London and co-founder in 1845 of St. Mary's Hospital, believed that masturbation, or unnatural irritation of the clitoris, caused hysteria, spinal irritation, fits, idiocy, mania and death. He therefore set to work to remove the clitoris whenever he had the opportunity of doing so, according to his obituary. Brown performed several clitoridectomies between 1859 and 1866. In the United States, J. Marion Sims followed Brown's work and in 1862 slit the neck of a woman's uterus and amputated her clitoris, for the relief of the nervous or hysterical condition as recommended by Baker Brown. When Brown published his views on the curability of certain forms of insanity, epilepsy, catalepsy, and hysteria in females, doctors in London accused him of quackery and expelled him from the Obstetrical Society. Later in the 19th century, A. J. Bloch, a surgeon in New Orleans, removed the clitoris of a 2-year-old girl who was reportedly masturbating. According to a 1985 paper in the Obstetrical and Gynecological Survey, clitoridectomy was performed in the United States into the 1960s to treat hysteria, erotomania, and lesbianism. From the mid-1950s, James Burt, a gynecologist in Dayton, Ohio, performed non-standard repairs of episiotomies after childbirth, adding more stitches to make the vaginal opening smaller. From 1966 until 1989, he performed love surgery by cutting women's pubococcygeus muscle, repositioning the vagina and urethra, and removing the clitoral hood, thereby making their genital area more appropriate, in his view, for intercourse in the missionary position. Women are structurally inadequate for intercourse, he wrote. He said he would turn them into horny little mice. In the 1960s and 1970s he performed these procedures without consent while repairing episiotomies and performing hysterectomies and other surgery. He said he had performed a variation of them on 4,000 women by 1975. Following complaints, he was required in 1989 to stop practicing medicine in the United States. Little knives in their sheaths, that they may fight with the church. The time has come, elders, when Kenyatta comes, you will be given women's clothes, and you will have to cook him his food. Protestant missionaries in British East Africa began campaigning against FGM in the early 20th century, when Dr. John Arthur joined the Church of Scotland mission in Kikuyu. An important ethnic marker, the practice was known by the Kikuyu, the country's main ethnic group, as Irua for both girls and boys. It involved excision for girls and removal of the foreskin for boys. Unexcised Kikuyu women were outcasts. Jomo Kenyatta, General Secretary of the Kikuyu Central Association and later Kenya's first Prime Minister, wrote in 1938 that, for the Kikuyu, the institution of FGM was the conditio sine qua non of the whole teaching of tribal law, religion, and morality. No proper Kikuyu man or woman would marry or have sexual relations with someone who was not circumcised. A woman's responsibilities toward the tribe began with her initiation. Her age and place within tribal history was traced to that day, and the group of girls with whom she was cut was named according to current events, an oral tradition that allowed the Kikuyu to track people and events going back hundreds of years. Beginning with the CSM mission in 1925, several missionary churches declared that FGM was prohibited for African Christians. The CSM announced that Africans practicing it would be excommunicated, which resulted in hundreds leaving or being expelled. The standoff turned FGM into a focal point of the Kenyan independence movement. The 1929–1931 period is known in the country's historiography as the female circumcision controversy. In 1929 the Kenya Missionary Council began referring to FGM as the sexual mutilation of women, rather than circumcision, and a person's stance toward the practice became a test of loyalty, either to the Christian churches or to the Kikuyu Central Association. Huldah Stumpf, an American missionary with the Africa Inland Mission who opposed FGM in the girls' school she helped to run, was murdered in 1930. Edward Grigg, the governor of Kenya, told the British Colonial Office that the killer, who was never identified, had tried to circumcise her. In 1956 the Council of Male Elders in Meru announced a ban on FGM. Over the next 3 years, thousands of girls cut each other's genitals with razor blades as a symbol of defiance. The movement came to be known as Gaitana, because to avoid naming their friends the girls said they had cut themselves. Historian Lynn Thomas described the episode as significant in the history of FGM because it made clear that its victims were also its perpetrators. 1929, Marion Scott Stevenson, Church of Scotland missionary in Kenya, calls FGM sexual mutilation of women. National Council of Churches of Kenya follow suit. Scottish missionaries require Kikuyu Christians to take an oath against FGM, most leave to form their own churches. 1930, January, American missionary Huldah Stumpf murdered in Kenya during protests about FGM. 1930s, religious leaders and British women lead campaign against FGM in Sudan. 1951, May, Egyptian medical journal, Al Doctor, issues booklet on dangers of FGM. 1957–1958, Egyptian journalist Amina al-Saidi and Haywa magazine editor Rabi Gaith publish articles on FGM. Late 1950s, Sudanese women's union campaigns against FGM in their magazine, Saad el-Marat. 1959, Egypt bans infibulation in state-run hospitals, allows partial clitoridectomy if parents request it. UN asks the WHO to investigate FGM, WHO responds that it is not a medical issue. 1960s, Central African Republic, Ghana, and Guinea, after gaining independence, pass laws restricting FGM. 1970, Egyptian physician Nawal el-Saada'i criticizes FGM in Al-Mar'awa al-Jins. 1972, Saada'i's The Naked Face of Women describes her own circumcision. 1975, United Nations International Women's Year. American social scientist Rose Oldfield Hayes calls it female genital mutilation in paper on FGM in Sudan. Reasons. French writer Benoit Groult calls FGM the best kept secret in the world in her And So I Tell. Austrian-American feminist Fran Hoskin begins writing about FGM in Women's International Network News. 1976–1985, UN's Decade for Women. 1976, British journalist Jill Tweedy calls FGM ritual mutilation of the female genitalia. 1977, March, Edna Adan Ismail of Somalia's Ministry of Health speaks against FGM to Somali Democratic Women's Organization. Support from women. 1978, American feminist Mary Daly criticizes FGM in GYN/Ecology. Senegalese writer Awa Thiam writes about FGM in La Parole Auxiliary Negresses. Social obligation, poor access to information. 1979, Fran Hoskin publishes the Hoskin Report, Genital and Sexual Mutilation of Females, the first to estimate global figures. UN Conference, Lusaka, Zambia, calls on women's groups to mobilize against FGM. Religion. History. February, WHO holds seminar, Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children, Khartoum, Sudan. October, Cairo Family Planning Association holds seminar, Bodily Mutilation of Females. 1980, British writer Cilla MacLean writes report on FGM for minority rights group in France. Antiquity. Europe and the United States. Opposition. Colonial opposition in Kenya. Growth of opposition. United Nations. Non-practicing countries. North America. Europe. Criticism of opposition. Tolerance versus human rights. Comparison with other procedures. Notes. Sources. March, Robin Morgan and Gloria Steinem call it female genital mutilation in Ms. Magazine. July, African Women Boycott Session featuring Fran Hoskin at UN's Mid-Decade Conference on Women, Copenhagen. 1981, French Association of Anthropologists publishes statement that at a certain feminism resuscitates the moralistic arrogance of yesterday's colonialism. 1981, Lillian Passmore Sanderson publishes Against the Mutilation of Women. 1982, Sudanese physician Asma El Darar publishes Study of FGM in Sudan, Woman, Why Do You Weep? Circumcision and Its Consequences. Somali writer Rakiya Haji Douali Abdallah publishes Sisters in Affliction, Circumcision and Infibulation of Women in Africa. 1983, F. Dorkinu founds Forward in London. The first known non-colonial campaign against FGM began in Egypt in the 1920s, when the Egyptian Doctors' Society called for a ban. There was a parallel campaign in Sudan, run by religious leaders and British women. Infibulation was banned there in 1946, but the law was unpopular and barely enforced. The Egyptian government banned infibulation in state-run hospitals in 1959, but allowed partial clitoridectomy if parents requested it. Works cited. In 1959, the Union asked the WHO to investigate FGM, but the latter responded that it was not a medical matter. Feminists took up the issue throughout the 1970s. The Egyptian physician and feminist Nawal El-Saada'i criticized FGM in her book Women and Sex. The book was banned in Egypt and El-Saada'i lost her job as Director General of Public Health. She followed up with a chapter, The Circumcision of Girls, in her book The Hidden Face of Eve, Women in the Arab World, which described her own clitoridectomy when she was 6 years old. I did not know what they had cut off from my body, and I did not try to find out. I just wept, and called out to my mother for help. But the worst shock of all was when I looked around and found her standing by my side. Yes, it was her, I could not be mistaken, in flesh and blood, right in the midst of these strangers, talking to them and smiling at them, as though they had not participated in slaughtering her daughter just a few moments ago. In 1975, Rose Oldfield Hayes, an American social scientist, became the first female academic to publish a detailed account of FGM, aided by her ability to discuss it directly with women in Sudan. Her article in American Ethnologist called it female genital mutilation, rather than female circumcision, and brought it to wider academic attention. 21 Edna Adan Ismail, who worked at the time for the Somalia Ministry of Health, discussed the health consequences of FGM in 1977 with the Somali Women's Democratic Organization. 2 years later, Fran Hoskin, an Austria-American feminist, published the Hoskin Report, Genital and Sexual Mutilation of Females, the first to offer global figures. She estimated that 110,529,000 women in 20 African countries had experienced FGM. The figures were speculative but consistent with later surveys. Describing FGM as a training ground for male violence, Hoskin accused female practitioners of participating in the destruction of their own kind. 5. The language caused a rift between Western and African feminists. African women boycotted a session featuring Hoskin during the UN's Mid-Decade Conference on Women in Copenhagen in July 1980. In 1979, the WHO held a seminar, Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children, in Khartoum, Sudan, and in 1981, Also in Khartoum, 150 academics and activists signed a pledge to fight FGM after a workshop held by the Babakar Badri Scientific Association for Women's Studies. Female circumcision mutilates and endangers women, combat it. Another BBSA's workshop in 1984 invited the international community to write a joint statement for the United Nations. It recommended that the goal of all African women should be the eradication of FGM and that, to sever the link between FGM and religion, clitoridectomy should no longer be referred to as sunnah. The Inter-African Committee on Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children, founded in 1984 in Dakar, Senegal, called for an end to the practice, as did the UN's World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993. The conference listed FGM as a form of violence against women, marking it as a human rights violation, rather than a medical issue. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, governments in Africa and the Middle East passed legislation banning or restricting FGM. In 2003, the African Union ratified the Maputo Protocol on the Rights of Women, which supported the elimination of FGM. By 2015, laws restricting FGM had been passed in at least 23 of the 27 African countries in which it is concentrated, although several fell short of a ban. In December 1993, the United Nations General Assembly included FGM in Resolution 48/104, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and from 2003 sponsored International Day of Zero Tolerance for Female Genital Mutilation, held every February 6. UNICEF began in 2003 to promote an evidence-based social norms approach, using ideas from game theory about how communities reach decisions about FGM, and building on the work of Gary Mackey on the demise of foot binding in China. In 2005, the UNICEF Innocenti Research Center in Florence published its first report on FGM. UNFPA and UNICEF launched a joint program in Africa in 2007 to reduce FGM by 40% within the 0-15 age group and eliminate it from at least one country by 2012, goals that were not met and which they later described as unrealistic. In 2008, several union bodies recognized FGM American Samoa a human rights violation, and in 2010, the union called upon healthcare providers to stop carrying out the procedures, including re-infibulation after childbirth and symbolic nicking. In 2012, the General Assembly passed Resolution 67/146, intensifying global efforts for the elimination of female genital mutilations. Immigration spread the practice to Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and North America, all of which outlawed it entirely or restricted it to consenting adults. Sweden outlawed FGM in 1982 with the act prohibiting the genital mutilation of women, the first Western country to do so. Several former colonial powers, including Belgium, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, introduced new laws or made clear that it was covered by existing legislation. As of 2013, legislation banning FGM had been passed in 33 countries outside Africa and the Middle East. In the United States, an estimated 513,000 women and girls had experienced FGM or were at risk as of 2012. A Nigerian woman successfully contested deportation in March 1994 on the grounds that her daughters might be cut, and in 1996 Fauzi Yakasinga from Togo became the first to be granted asylum to escape FGM. In 1996, the Federal Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Act made it illegal to perform FGM on minors for non-medical reasons, and in 2013 the Transport for Female Genital Mutilation Act prohibited transporting a minor out of the country for the purpose of FGM. In addition, 24 states have legislation banning FGM. The American Academy of Pediatrics opposes all forms of the practice, including pricking the clitoral skin. The first FGM conviction in the U.S. was in 2006, when Khalid Adam, who had emigrated from Ethiopia, was sentenced to 10 years after severing his 2-year-old daughter's clitoris with a pair of scissors. Canada recognized FGM as a form of persecution in July 1994, when it granted refugee status to Khadra Hassan Farah, who had fled Somalia to avoid her daughter being cut. In 1997 Section 268 of its criminal code was amended to ban FGM, except where the person is at least 18 years of age and there is no resulting bodily harm. As of July 2017 there had been no prosecutions. Canadian officials have expressed concern that a few thousand Canadian girls are at risk of vacation cutting, whereby girls are taken overseas to undergo the procedure, but as of 2017 there were no firm figures. According to the European Parliament, 500,000 women in Europe had undergone FGM as of March 2009. France is known for its tough stance against FGM. Up to 30,000 women there were thought to have experienced it as of 1995. According to Colette Gallard, a family planning counselor, when FGM was first encountered in France, the reaction was that Westerners ought not to intervene. It took the deaths of 2 girls in 1982, one of them 3 months old, for that attitude to change. In 1991 a French court ruled that the convention relating to the status of refugees offered protection to FGM victims. The decision followed an asylum application from Aminata Diop, who fled an FGM procedure in Mali. The practice is outlawed by several provisions of France's penal code that address bodily harm causing permanent mutilation or torture. All children under 6 who were born in France undergo medical examinations that include inspection of the genitals, and doctors are obliged to report FGM. The first civil suit was in 1982, and the first criminal prosecution in 1993. In 1999 a woman was given an 8-year sentence for having performed FGM on 48 girls. By 2014 over 100 parents and 2 practitioners had been prosecuted in over 40 criminal cases. Around 137,000 women and girls living in England and Wales were born in countries where FGM is practiced, as of 2011. Performing FGM on children or adults was outlawed under the Prohibition of Female Circumcision Act 1985. This was replaced by the Female Genital Mutilation Act 2003 and Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Act 2005, which added a prohibition on arranging FGM outside the country for British citizens or permanent residents. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women asked the government in July 2013 to ensure the full implementation of its legislation on FGM. The first charges were brought in 2014 against a physician and another man. The physician had stitched an infibulated woman after opening her for childbirth. Both men were acquitted in 2015. Anthropologists have accused FGM eradicationists of cultural colonialism, and have been criticized in turn for their moral relativism and failure to defend the idea of universal human rights. According to critics of the eradicationist position, the biological reductionism of the opposition to FGM, and the failure to appreciate FGM's cultural context, serves to other practitioners and undermine their agency, in particular when parents are referred to as mutilators. Africans who object to the tone of FGM opposition risk appearing to defend the practice. The feminist theorist Abiyamin Nyameka, herself strongly opposed to FGM, argues that renaming it female genital mutilation introduced a subtext of barbaric African and Muslim cultures and the West's relevance in purging. According to Ugandan law professor Sylvia Tamale, early Western opposition to FGM stemmed from a Judeo-Christian judgment that African sexual and family practices including dry sex, polygyny, bride price, and levirate marriage required correction. African feminists take strong exception to the imperialist, racist and dehumanizing infantilization of African women, according to Tamale. Commentators highlight the appropriation of women's bodies as exhibits, such as the 1996 publication of the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs of a 16-year-old Kenyan girl undergoing FGM. The photographs were published by 12 American newspapers, without the girl consenting either to be photographed or to have the images published. The debate has highlighted a tension between anthropology and feminism, with the former's focus on tolerance and the latter's on equal rights for women. According to the anthropologist Christine Wally, a common position within anti-FGM literature has been to present African women as victims of false consciousness participating in their own oppression, a position promoted by feminists in the 1970s and 1980s, including Fran Hoskin, Mary Daly, and Hanny Lightfoot Klein. It prompted the French Association of Anthropologists to issue a statement in 1981, at the height of the early debates, that a certain feminism resuscitates the moralistic arrogance of yesterday's colonialism. Nyameka argues that the crucial question, broader than FGM, is why the female body is subjected to so much abuse and indignity, including in the West. Several authors have drawn a parallel between FGM and cosmetic procedures. 32 Ronan Conroy of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland wrote in 2006 that cosmetic genital procedures were driving the advance of female genital mutilation by encouraging women to see natural variations as defects. Anthropologist Fadwe El-Gindi compared FGM to breast enhancement, in which the maternal function of the breast becomes secondary to men's sexual pleasure. Benoit Grult made a similar point in 1975, citing FGM and cosmetic surgery as sexist and patriarchal. The medical anthropologist Carla Obermeyer maintains that FGM may be conducive to a subject's social well-being in the same way that rhinoplasty and male circumcision are. Despite the 2007 ban in Egypt, women there wanting FGM for their daughters seek amaliyat tajmil to remove what they see as excess genital tissue. The WHO does not define procedures such as labiaplasty and clitoral hood reduction as FGM, but its definition aims to avoid loopholes, so several elective practices do fall within it. Some of the laws banning FGM, including in Canada and the US, cover minors only, but several countries, including Sweden and the UK, have banned it regardless of consent. The legislation in those countries does seem to cover cosmetic procedures. Sweden, for example, has banned operations on the outer female sexual organs with a view to mutilating them or bringing about some other permanent change in them, regardless of whether or not consent has been given for the operation. Gynecologist Birgitta Essen and anthropologist Sarah Johnsdottir argue that the law seems to distinguish between Western and African genitals, and deems only African women unfit to make their own decisions. 33. Arguing against suggested similarities between FGM and dieting or body shaping, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum writes that a key difference is that FGM is mostly conducted on children using physical force. The distinction between social pressure and physical force is morally and legally salient, she argues, comparable to the distinction between seduction and rape. She argues further that the literacy of women in practicing countries is generally poorer than in developed nations, and that this reduces their ability to make informed choices. Several commentators maintain that children's rights are violated with the genital alteration of intersex children, who are born with anomalies that physicians choose to correct. Legal scholars Nancy Ehrenreich and Mark Barr write that thousands of these procedures take place every year in the United States, and say that they are medically unnecessary, more extensive than FGM, and have more serious physical and mental consequences. They attribute the silence of anti-FGM campaigners about intersex procedures to white privilege and a refusal to acknowledge that similar unnecessary and harmful genital cutting occurs in their own backyards. The Royal Dutch Medical Association questions why the ethics regarding male genital alterations should be viewed any differently from female genital alterations. WHO, 2008, common tendency to describe type I as removal of the prepuce, whereas this has not been documented as a traditional form of female genital mutilation. However, in some countries, medicalized female genital mutilation can include removal of the prepuce only, but this form appears to be relatively rare. Almost all known forms of female genital mutilation that remove tissue from the clitoris also cut all or part of the clitoral glands itself. Book 16, Chapter 4, 16.4.9, and then to the harbor of Antipholus, and, above this, to the Creophagi, of whom the males have their sexual glands mutilated and the women are excised in the Jewish fashion. Nahid F. Tobia, Iman Hussein Sharif, Female Genital Mutilation, Have We Made Progress? International Journal of Gynecology and Obstetrics, 82, September 2003, 251-261. doi 10.1016/S0020-729200229-7 PMID 1449992. Gamal I. Sirur, The Issue of Re-Infibulation, International Journal of Gynecology and Obstetrics, 109, May 2010, 9396. doi 10.1016/J.Ijo.2010.01.001 PMID 201382774. For the rest, Bridget Bagnall and Esmeralda Mariano, Politics of Naming Sexual Practices, in Tamale 2011, 272-276. Maro Usman Mandara, Female Genital Mutilation in Nigeria, International Journal of Gynecology and Obstetrics, 84, 291-298. doi 10.1016/J.Ijo.2003.06.001 PMID 15001386. Pam Bellook, Michigan case adds U.S. dimension to debate on genital mutilation, The New York Times, June 10, 2017. Janus Body, Wombs, and Alien Spirits, Women, Men, and the Tsar Cult in Northern Sudan, Madison, University of Wisconsin Press, 1989, 52. Adele Berlin, Circumcision, The Oxford Dictionary of the Jewish Religion, New York, Oxford University Press, 2011, 173. Esther K. Hicks, Infibulation, Female mutilation in Islamic Northeastern Africa, Transaction Publishers, 1996, 19 ff. Donaldson James, Susan. Ohio woman still scarred by love doctor's sex surgery. ABC News. For Irua, Jomo Kenyatta, Facing Mount Kenya, New York, Vintage Books, 1962, 129, For Iragu Being Outcasts, Kenyatta, 127, and Zabus 2008, 48-49. Also see Robert Strayer, Jocelyn Murray, The CMS and Female Circumcision, in Robert Strayer, The Making of Missionary Communities in East Africa, New York, State University of New York Press, 1978, 139 ff. Also see Lynn M. Thomas, Gaetana, The Gender and Generational Politics of the 1956 Ban on Clitoridectomy in Meru, Kenya, Gender and History, 8, November 1996, 338-363. doi 10.1111/J.1468-0424.1996.tb00062.x. Homa Khalili, Nawal El Saadai, Egypt's Radical Feminist, The Guardian, April 15, 2010. Canada, Section 268, Criminal Code, Justice Laws website, Government of Canada. Inri Fauzi Yake Singha, File A73476-695, U.S. Department of Justice, Executive Office for Immigration Review, decided June 13, 1996. Pam Bellook, Group backs ritual nick as female circumcision option, The New York Times, May 6, 2010. For an early article on FGM in the UK, see Black and DeBell 1995. For the photographs, Stephanie Welsh archived October 7, 2015 at the Wayback Machine, 1996 Pulitzer Prize winners. For other examples, Nyameka 2005, 3033. Also see Yael Tamir, Hands Off Clitoridectomy archived August 8, 2014 at the Wayback Machine, Boston Review, Summer 1996, Martha Nussbaum, Double Moral Standards. Archived August 8, 2014 at the Wayback Machine, Boston Review, October/November 1996. United Nations Reports. Personal Stories.